The coldness in my wife's eyes was something I'd never seen in our 40 years of marriage. Her manicured fingernails tapped rhythmically against my mahogany desk, breaking the stillness. Then came a dry, humorless laugh that made my blood run cold. Harry, you're going to have to beg me for breakfast money from now on. Don't count on those credit cards, and don't look at the bank accounts either. Starting right now, if you want so much as a penny for a cup of coffee, you ask me first. And if I'm in a good mood, maybe I'll give it to you. My son, the boy I raised and sent to the finest college money could buy, just sat there nodding along, looking at his mother with pure admiration. They thought they had won. They thought this old man was totally done for. What they didn't realize was that they had just started a war they could never win. My name is Harry Coleman. I'm 72 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I genuinely believed I was the patriarch of a loving family. I built Coleman Construction from a single pickup truck and a rusty box of tools into a multi-million-dollar commercial empire. I gave my wife, Brenda, a life of absolute luxury. I handed my son Ryan a career he didn't earn. I thought I was respected, but I was wrong. If you're new here, take a deep breath, because what I'm about to tell you is a nightmare that could happen to anyone who trusts the wrong people, even when they're your own flesh and blood. It all started on a Tuesday that felt completely normal. The morning sun was shining bright. I put on my favorite charcoal suit, the one Brenda always said made me look distinguished and commanding. I felt good. I felt strong. My morning routine was simple. I'd drive over to the Roasted Bean, a little coffee shop 3 blocks from our estate, pick up a black coffee and a plain bagel, and read the Wall Street Journal. It was my quiet time. The baristas all knew me by name. I didn't even have to open the glass door before they started making my order. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman," the young woman at the counter said. Her name was Sarah, and she was always smiling. "The usual today?" "Yes, please, Sarah," I said, reaching for my wallet. I felt the familiar weight of the leather and pulled out my American Express Platinum card. It was a badge of decades of hard work, a card with no credit limit. That piece of plastic had paid for family vacations across Europe, Ryan's tuition at Yale, and the diamond necklace Brenda wore to charity galas. I tapped it against the card reader, waiting for the familiar beep. Instead, a harsh, buzzing sound echoed through the cafe. The tiny screen flashed bright red. Transaction declined. I frowned. "That's strange," I said with a light chuckle. "I must have demagnetized it. Let me try it again." Sarah looked a bit uncomfortable as she swiped it manually. Buzz. Transaction declined. "Mr. Coleman," she said, lowering her voice so the people in line behind me wouldn't hear, "it says the card has been deactivated." The line behind me was growing long. I could feel several pairs of eyes burning into the back of my neck. A man in a hurry let out a loud, impatient sigh. My face started to burn. I hadn't felt embarrassment like that in decades. I was Harry Coleman. My bills were always paid early. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice tight. "Let me just use the Visa." I pulled out my backup card, the one linked to our joint operating account. This time I inserted the chip. I stared at the screen. Processing. Processing. Then came that awful red light again. Contact bank. Card restricted. My hands began to tremble, not from old age, but from the sudden icy rush of adrenaline. This was impossible. That checking account had over $200,000 in it yesterday. I had checked it myself. "Sir, is everything okay?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with pity. I hated that look. I didn't want pity. I just wanted my coffee, and I wanted my dignity. I fumbled through my pockets until I found a $20 bill. Cash. Thank God for cash. "Keep the change," I muttered, grabbing the cup and walking out of the shop without looking back, my ears burning hot. I felt like a criminal. I felt like a fraud. I sat in my car, a classic Mercedes I had personally restored. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I dialed the bank. An automated voice chimed in with a cheerful tone. "We're sorry. The access code you entered is invalid. Please contact the primary account holder." The primary account holder, that was me. It had always been me. I drove home. I didn't speed. Instead, I drove with a cold, calculated slowness. My mind was racing. Was it identity theft? Did a hacker clear out the accounts? Deep down, I knew it wasn't a stranger. A stranger would steal the cash and run. A stranger wouldn't change the primary access codes. A stranger wouldn't restrict the cards like this. This was an inside job. I pulled into the driveway of the house I built with my own hands 20 years ago. It was a massive, beautiful, grand estate. Usually, looking at it gave me a surge of pride, but today it felt like a fortress meant to keep me out. I walked through the front door. The house was quiet, terribly quiet. "Brenda!" I called out. My voice echoed off the high ceilings of the foyer. No answer. I walked toward my home office. The double oak doors were closed tight. I reached for the handle and pushed them open. The sight in front of me made me freeze in my tracks. My son Ryan was sitting in my chair. He wasn't just sitting there. He was leaning all the way back with his feet kicked up on my desk, wearing an expensive Italian suit I had paid for. He was spinning a pen between his fingers. It was my pen. Brenda was sitting on the leather sofa opposite him, sipping iced tea. They looked like two executives having a pleasant morning meeting. They looked up when I walked in, neither of them showing the slightest bit of surprise. They were expecting me. "What on earth is going on?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. "I went to get coffee and both my cards were declined. The bank says I'm not the primary account holder anymore." Ryan took his feet off the desk, but he didn't stand up. He let out a cold, condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, that? Yeah, we were planning on talking to you about that at dinner tonight, Dad. But I guess you figured it out early." "You were planning on telling me?" I repeated, taking a step further into the room. "Telling me what? That you robbed me? That you hacked into my accounts?" Brenda set her iced tea down on the coaster. She smoothed her dress and looked at me with a calm, almost bored expression. "Harry, don't be so dramatic. Nobody robbed you. We're simply restructuring the family finances. We had a meeting with the family lawyer early this morning." I stared at her. I hadn't met with any lawyer. "That's right," Ryan said. "We're acting under the terms of the power of attorney you signed 5 years ago. Remember? Back when you had that minor heart scare and signed the paperwork granting us control in the event you were unable or unfit to manage complex assets." "I'm not unfit," I roared. "I'm standing right here. I ran a board meeting yesterday. I drove myself home. I am completely fine." Brenda let out a sigh, as if dealing with a throwing child. "Harry, listen to yourself. You're yelling. Your face is bright red. This is exactly what we're talking about. You're getting older and you're becoming far too emotional. We've noticed it for months now. You forget things. You make impulsive decisions." "I don't forget things," I snapped. That was when Ryan stood up. He walked around the desk and stood right in front of me. He was taller than me now, but he had never looked me straight in the eye like a real man before. He used to look away, but today he stared right at me. "Dad, look. We're doing this for your own good. The market is unstable and you're far too conservative with investments. We need to protect the family legacy. We transferred the liquid assets into a secure trust managed by Mom and me. It's safer this way." "Safer?" I spat the word back at him. "You humiliated me in public. You cut off my access to my own hard-earned money." "It's not just your money anymore, Harry," Brenda said softly. "It's the family's money, and you've been wasting enough of it. All those donations to veterans' charities, the money spent restoring that old car. It was draining us. We're just putting a stop to the bleeding." I looked at my wife, then at my son, and all I saw in their eyes was pure greed. This was never about protecting assets or my health. This was about power and control. They had planned this for a long time. That power of attorney document was meant for an emergency like a coma or a stroke, not a random Tuesday morning while I was in perfect health. "So what now?" I asked, forcing myself to stay calm. "How do I buy gas? How do I buy food?" Brenda reached into her purse and pulled out a card. It was a generic prepaid debit card, the kind you buy off a rack at a drugstore. She tossed it onto the desk. It slid across the dark wood and stopped right near my hand. "There's $500 on there," she said. "That's your allowance for the week. It should be plenty for your coffee and a modest lunch. If you need more, you can submit a request to Ryan, and we'll review it." I stared at that cheap piece of plastic. $500. Just last year, I generated millions of dollars in revenue, and now I was being given a pocket allowance like a child. "You can't do this," I said. "We already did," Ryan said, settling back into my desk chair. He looked comfortable in it, far too comfortable. Now, Dad, why don't you go upstairs and take a nap? You look tired, and we have a lot of paperwork to get through here. I stood there for a long time. My heart was beating like a trapped bird in my chest. I wanted to flip the desk over. I wanted to grab Ryan by his collar and throw him out the window. I wanted to scream until the glass shattered. But as I looked at them, I saw the smug satisfaction on their faces. They were waiting for me to explode. They wanted me to blow up. If I reacted with anger, if I started breaking things, they'd call the authorities. They'd have all the proof they needed to claim I was mentally unstable, to prove I was the crazy old man they were pretending I was. I took a deep, steadying breath. I picked up the prepaid card, feeling the cold plastic against my fingers, and looked Brenda dead in the eye. "I won't forget this," I said quietly. She just laughed. That dry, chilling laugh that told me she thought I was utterly helpless. "Oh, Harry, you will forget, just like you forget your vitamins. Now go on." I turned around and walked out of my office. I walked out of my house and sat down on the front porch steps. The sun was still shining bright, but the whole world felt gray. They had taken my money, my control over the company, and my dignity. Yet as I sat there gripping that plastic card, a cold, hard resolve began to settle deep in my chest. They thought they had taken down the lion. They thought I was just an old, toothless animal who would lie down and accept defeat. They were dead wrong. I looked at the card once more. $500? Fine. I could work with $500. 40 years ago, I started this entire company with less than that. They wanted to play games. They wanted to see who was smarter and tougher. I slipped the card into my pocket. I didn't go take a nap. I walked straight down the driveway. I needed to make a phone call, but not from my personal cell phone, which was probably monitored anyway. I needed a burner phone or a public payphone if I could find one. I needed to call the one person Ryan and Brenda forgot about, the person who knew where all the bodies were buried, because he helped me dig the holes. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. As I stepped off my property, I didn't feel like an old man anymore. I felt like a soldier heading right back into the trenches. They wanted a war, and I was going to give them one. They made one fatal mistake. They assumed I had shown them every card in my hand. They thought they knew about every account, every asset, and every company shell. They were dead wrong. I pulled the cheap plastic card back out of my pocket. It felt light, thin, and entirely insignificant in my hand. Just hours ago, I was a captain of industry, a respected figure walking into any room with authority. Now I held a prepaid card like a teenager getting his first allowance. My thumb rubbed over the raised numbers on the front. It didn't even have my name on it, just valued customer. That's what I'd been reduced to in my own home. A customer, and only a valued one if I kept my mouth shut. Brenda watched me closely. Her eyes narrowed as if waiting for me to throw the card back in her face. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to snap it in half and toss it onto the rug, but I caught Ryan looking at his phone, his thumb hovering right over the screen. He was ready to call someone, maybe a doctor, maybe the police. They were begging for me to lose my composure so they could prove old Harry had finally lost his mind. I forced my hands to relax and slid the card back into my pocket, right alongside my useless platinum card. "Thank you, Brenda," I said. My voice was raspy but steady. "I suppose I should be grateful." "You really should," Ryan chimed in, without even looking up from the documents spread across my desk. He was flipping through my quarterly financial reports, papers he'd never shown an ounce of interest in before today. "We're saving you from yourself, Dad. You have no idea how complex the new tax codes are. The lawyers explained it all this morning. If we leave these assets under your name, estate taxes will destroy us when you pass. By shifting everything into a trust now, we're protecting the family legacy. We're protecting you." I looked at my son, listening to him throw around corporate terms he barely understood from a textbook. Asset protection, liability isolation. It sounded impressive if you didn't know better, but I did. I built this business back when tax codes were typed out on manual typewriters. I had survived audits that would make weaker men collapse. This wasn't about tax protection at all. This was a hostile takeover. "So this is all for taxes?" I asked, playing the part of a confused, broken old man. I scratched my head and let my shoulders slump down. I didn't realize things were so critical. Extremely critical, Harry, Brenda said, leaning forward. Her tone softened into that sickly sweet voice she used whenever she wanted something. We're doing this because we love you. We don't want you stressing over bills or balance sheets anymore. You've worked hard your entire life. It's time to rest and let Ryan handle the heavy lifting while you enjoy retirement. She pointed a manicured finger toward my pocket. I put $500 on that card for the week. That should easily cover your little breakfasts and your daily papers. But listen to me, Harry. Don't go wasting it on expensive cigars or that high-end scotch you like. We have to be disciplined now. The restructuring requires strict cash flow management, and we can't have you burning money, literally or figuratively. Disciplined. The woman who bought a $5,000 designer handbag last month just because she was bored was now giving me lessons on discipline. I felt a dark laugh rising in my chest, but I forced it back down. $500, I repeated, for a whole week? Yes, she said firmly. And if you run out, you wait until next Tuesday for a refill. It'll teach you some control. You've been far too reckless lately, Harry, buying vintage car parts online, sending donations to that homeless shelter without consulting us. It all stops today. I stared at the floor, letting them see a beaten man, a defeated husband. I mumbled quietly. I was just trying to fix up the Mercedes. That Mercedes is a money pit, Ryan snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were cold. Honestly, we should probably sell it. It takes up way too much room in the garage anyway. I could use that space for my new Porsche. My blood ran cold. That Mercedes was the very first car I bought with money I earned myself. I had painstakingly restored every single bolt on that machine. It was my sanctuary. Please, I said, letting a slight shake creep into my voice. Don't sell the car. It's the only project I have left. Brenda waved her hand dismissively. We'll see, Harry, if you behave yourself and stick to your budget. Now, why don't you run upstairs? Ryan and I have an emergency call with our investors in 10 minutes, and we need the room. Investors. My investors. Men and women I had known for 30 years. People who had shaken my hand and looked me in the eye. Were they in on this too? Or had Ryan and Brenda spun them a web of lies about my failing health, telling everyone I was losing my mind and unfit to lead? I turned and walked away, my feet feeling heavy like I was dragging them through wet cement. I reached the door, my hand resting on the brass knob, and looked back one last time. They had already forgotten I was in the room. Brenda was showing Ryan something on a tablet, and both of them were chuckling quietly. They looked like two thieves celebrating a successful heist. And that's exactly what it was, a robbery. Right in front of my face, they had stripped my life away from beneath my feet. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind me. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silent house. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and aged wood. The home I had built to raise a family now felt like a prison, and I was the inmate. I reached into my pocket and touched the debit card once again. $500. They thought this was the leash that would keep me tied up. They thought this small allowance would keep me quiet and compliant, assuming that taking away my credit cards meant taking away my power. They were fools. They forgot who I was before all of this. They forgot that I built an empire out of pure grit and bare hands, not platinum cards. I walked down the long corridor toward the kitchen, needing time to think and construct a plan. Their tax story was full of holes. If this was a legitimate corporate restructuring for tax purposes, there would be stacks of documents requiring my physical signature. There would be notarized records. You cannot legally strip a man of his entire estate without his signature unless you forge it. An icy chill ran down my spine. Forgery. Ryan had practiced my signature for years. As a teenager, he used to do it as a party trick, laughing off how well he could copy my name on checks. We used to laugh about it back then. I wasn't laughing now. If they had activated a power of attorney, they would still need medical documentation proving I was incapacitated. Where did they get that? Unless they paid off a doctor. The sheer scale of their betrayal was becoming crystal clear. This wasn't just spur-of-the-moment greed. It was a premeditated conspiracy. They had been plotting this for months, maybe even years. While I was working 80-hour weeks to fund their lavish vacations, they were plotting how to throw me out. While I was teaching Ryan how to read a balance sheet, he was learning how to cook the books. I stepped into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of tap water, staring at my reflection in the polished granite countertop. I looked old. My hair was gray, my skin lined with deep wrinkles. But my eyes were completely clear, and my mind was sharper than ever. They had overlooked the most critical thing about me, my will to survive. I took a slow sip of the water. It tasted metallic. "Don't spend it on cigars," Brenda had said. A dark, tight smile crept across my face. I wasn't going to spend a single cent of that $500 on cigars. I was going to use it for something far more dangerous. I was going to use it to buy the truth. I needed to get out of this house, away from their prying eyes and suffocating lies. I checked my watch. It was only 11 in the morning. I still had time. I walked out through the back door, avoiding the garage where my Mercedes was parked. If I went near that car, Ryan might come out and bring up selling it again, and I couldn't guarantee I'd keep my temper in check. I walked down the long driveway, past the manicured hedges and the stone fountain, stepping out onto the public sidewalk. I walked 3 full blocks until I reached a public bus stop. I hadn't ridden a city bus in over 20 years, but Harry Coleman was a man who knew how to adapt. I sat on the wooden bench and waited. When the bus pulled up, I paid with a few dollar bills from my pocket. I didn't want to touch that debit card just yet. They might be tracking the transactions, and the moment I swiped it, they'd know exactly where I was. I rode the bus into the heart of the city, blending in with the crowd. Exhausted nurses, students with headphones, construction workers covered in dust. These were my people. This was where I originally came from. Ryan and Brenda lived in a bubble of country clubs and private jets. They had completely forgotten what the real world was like. I hadn't. I got off near the financial district and stood on the corner, looking up at the towering skyscrapers reaching into the sky. Somewhere inside one of those massive buildings lay the truth. I needed to find out what legal maneuvers they had used to lock me out. I needed to see if my name was still on the deeds, the titles, and the primary accounts. But I couldn't go to my usual attorney. He was the family lawyer Brenda mentioned, the one who was clearly in their pocket. If I went to him, he'd pick up the phone and call Ryan immediately to report that I was asking questions. No, I needed an outsider, someone who owed me a favor, someone who hated corruption just as much as I did. I reached back into my pocket and touched the plastic card again. It was a symbol of their disrespect, but it was also my greatest weapon. As long as they believed I was barely scraping by on their handouts, they wouldn't expect me to strike back from the shadows. They thought I was beaten, sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons. They had no idea I was marching straight into battle. I pulled my collar up against the cold wind and began walking toward the older part of town, heading for the dusty little law office of a man named Peterson. He didn't have fancy marble floors or a view of the lake, but he was the finest forensic accountant I knew, and he held a deep grudge against big firm corruption. As I walked, Brenda's voice echoed repeatedly in my mind for a whole week. I was going to make that $500 last the week, all right? And I was going to make them pay for every single penny of it. The lie they told me was a good one. It sounded reasonable and was filled with convincing details. But it suffered from one fatal flaw. They picked the wrong man to cross. Taking a public bus to the industrial park was a humbling experience, but I kept my chin held high. I sat right between a young mother trying to calm a crying baby and a man who smelled strongly of stale tobacco, holding tightly onto my prepaid debit card as if it were a lifeline. When the bus finally hissed to a stop 2 blocks away from Coleman Construction, my legs felt stiff, but my determination was harder than the concrete beneath my feet. I walked down the familiar road, a path I had driven thousands of times in my work truck and later in my Mercedes. The building rose before me, a solid 3-story structure built of red brick and reinforced glass. Normally, looking at it filled me with a deep, quiet sense of pride. It was 40 years of my sweat and sacrifice brought to life. But today, as I stared up at the large sign reading Coleman Construction, A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The name on the building was the same, but the energy of the place had completely shifted. It felt hostile. I pushed through the glass double doors, expecting the familiar, quiet chime that usually announced a visitor's arrival. Instead, there was dead silence. The warm oak reception desk I had installed 20 years ago was gone. In its place stood a cold, massive slab of white marble that looked far more like a tombstone than a welcoming counter. Sitting behind it was a young woman I'd never seen before. She was tapping frantically on her phone, long acrylic nails clicking loudly against the glass screen. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice authoritative. She held up a single finger, finished her text, and then slowly raised her eyes. She gave me a blank, completely uninterested look. "Can I help you, sir? Deliveries go around to the back entrance." "I'm not a delivery driver," I said, taking a step closer. "I'm Harry Coleman. I own this company." She blinked once, then typed something into her computer. "I don't see a Harry Coleman listed in the active directory," she said, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "Are you looking for someone specific? Do you have an appointment?" My blood started to boil. I built the very wall she was sitting inside. I paid the electrical bill powering her monitor. And here she was, asking if I had an appointment. "I don't need an appointment to walk into my own building," I said, my voice rising. "Where's Sarah? Where's the receptionist who's worked here for 10 years? "Oh, Sarah was let go last week," the girl said, popping a piece of gum. Restructuring. "I'm Tiffany. If you don't have an appointment, sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wait in the seating area while I notify security." Security? We had never needed security. We were a family business. Ignoring her completely, I brushed past the desk and headed straight down the hallway toward the executive suites. "Sir, you can't go back there!" Tiffany yelled behind me, scrambling to grab her phone. I marched down the corridor. The walls used to be lined with photographs of our proudest projects: bridges, schools, medical facilities. Now the walls were bare. The photos were gone, replaced by meaningless abstract art. It was as if they were systematically erasing the entire history of the company. I needed to see Frank. Frank Miller had served as my CFO for 30 years. He was the only person who understood the numbers better than I did, and he served as the company's moral compass. If anyone could explain what was happening to the bank accounts, it was Frank. I reached the door at the very end of the hall. The brass nameplate that used to read Frank Miller, Chief Financial Officer, was gone. In its place was a tiny yellow, sticky note that read, Acting Director of Finance. I pushed the door open without bothering to knock. "Frank, we need to talk," I began. But the man sitting behind the desk wasn't Frank. He was a young guy, late 20s, with slicked back hair, wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck. He was actively shredding documents. The shredder was humming loudly, swallowing pages at a blinding speed. He jumped when I walked in, looking like a deer caught in headlights. He quickly slammed a palm down over a manila folder, hiding whatever he had been reviewing. "Who are you?" I demanded, striding into the room. "Where is Frank?" The young man stood up, adjusting his tie nervously. He had an edgy, sharp quality about him. "You must be Mr. Coleman," he said, forcing a tight smile. "I heard you might drop by. I'm Jason. Ryan brought me in to help modernize the accounting side." "Modernize?" I spat out the word. "Where is Frank?" Jason cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward the open doorway. "Mr. Miller decided to take an early retirement, effective immediately. He wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren." "Liar!" I shouted. "Frank doesn't have grandchildren. His wife passed away 5 years ago, and this job was his life. He would never leave in the middle of a fiscal quarter. What did you do to him?" I started moving around the desk. I wanted to see what was inside that folder he was hiding. I wanted to see what he was feeding into the shredder. "Sir, please, you can't be back here," Jason stammered, stepping backward defensively. "These are confidential corporate documents." "Confidential to whom?" I roared. "I'm the founder." I reached down to grab the folder. Jason tried to block me, but he was light. I brushed his arm aside and grabbed the folder. Before I could open it, the door behind me slammed open. "Dad, what on earth are you doing?" It was Ryan. He stood in the doorway, his face flushed red with anger. His suit jacket was off, and his hair was slightly disheveled. Standing right behind him were two large security guards I'd never seen before. Holding the folder tight, I turned to face my son. "Where is Frank, Ryan? Why is this kid sitting in his office? Why is he shredding company files?" Ryan stepped into the room and snatched the folder out of my hands, throwing it back onto the desk. "Frank was old, Dad, just like you. He couldn't keep up with the new software. He was making mistakes. We gave him a generous severance package and sent him on his way. It was time for fresh blood. Jason here is a wizard with corporate tax structuring." "Fresh blood?" I said, glaring at Jason, who was now smirking safely behind Ryan. "You mean someone who just does what he's told? Someone who won't ask questions? Frank would never have allowed you to freeze my cards. Frank would never let you transfer assets without my explicit signature." Ryan let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "This is exactly why you can't be here, Dad. You're paranoid. You're coming in here, screaming at employees, disrupting the workflow. Look at Jason. You terrified him." I looked at Jason. He didn't look terrified at all. He looked guilty. "I want to see the books, Ryan," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I want to see the ledgers for the past 6 months. If everything is completely above board, then show me." Ryan laughed, a cold, condescending sound. "You wouldn't understand them anyway, Dad. Everything is digital now, up in the cloud. You struggle just to check your email. Go home. Enjoy your retirement. Stop trying to micromanage a world you don't belong to anymore." "I'm not leaving until I get real answers," I said, holding my ground. Ryan turned to the security guards and gave a brief nod. "Please escort Mr. Coleman off the premises and make sure he doesn't take anything with him." The two guards stepped forward. They were built broad, their uniforms tight across their chests. They looked at me without a drop of respect, treating me like nothing more than a disturbance that needed to be cleared out. "Mr. Coleman, please come with us," one of them said, reaching for my arm. "Don't touch me!" I snapped, pulling back sharply. I looked straight at Ryan. He was checking his watch, as if kicking his father out of the building he built was just another item on his afternoon checklist. "You're making a mistake, Ryan," I said. "A massive mistake." Ryan didn't even look up. "Goodbye, Dad. Take the bus home. It builds character." I walked out of the office with a guard flanking each side of me, looking like a criminal being transferred to a cell. We walked past the open doors of the other offices. The employees, people I had personally hired, people whose families I knew, looked up briefly, then quickly cast their eyes back down. They were terrified. They saw what was happening. If the founder himself could be marched out like garbage, not a single one of them was safe. We reached the lobby. Tiffany, the new receptionist, watched with a smug grin as the guards pushed the glass doors open for me. "Have a wonderful day, sir," she called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I stumbled out onto the sidewalk. The afternoon heat hit me hard, but inside I felt completely numb. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind me, automatically locking. I stood there staring at the reflection in the glass. I could see myself. My clothes were disheveled. My tie was crooked. I looked like a troubled old man who had caused a scene. As I straightened my tie and smoothed down my jacket, my mind started racing. Frank hadn't retired. Frank had been pushed out. You don't fire a loyal CFO unless he refuses to go along with something wrong. And you don't hire a nervous kid to run a shredder all day unless you're actively hiding something. Ryan said I was disrupting the workflow. He said I was interfering. He was right about one thing. I was interfering with their plan. Instead of walking toward the bus stop, I headed toward a small diner down the street, the place where Frank used to eat lunch every single Tuesday. If he really went away, he wouldn't be there. But if he was scared, if he was laying low, he might still be somewhere close by. Ryan thought he had won this round. He thought kicking me out of the building would keep me in the dark, but it did the exact opposite. It confirmed every suspicion I had. The locked doors, the new faces, the shredder, it all pointed to one thing. They weren't just taking my money. They were using my company for something dangerous. I touched the prepaid debit card in my pocket. I had been driven out of my own castle, but I was nowhere near out of this fight. I needed to find Frank. If I found him, I knew he'd lay it all out for me. The rot ran deep, and I was the only one left who could cut it out. By the time I made it back home from the diner, the sun had already set, casting long, jagged shadows across the lawn I used to mow myself every weekend. I walked inside, and the earlier dead silence was replaced by the clinking of silverware and the hum of casual conversation. Dinner had already started. That used to be my favorite time of day, when the noise of the construction sites faded, and I could just be a husband and a father. But walking into the dining room, I realized that life was gone for good. I was stepping right into a tank of sharks. My mother-in-law, Agnes, was sitting at the head of the long table, my seat. She was 80 years old, a woman who had never worked a single day in her life, yet held aggressive opinions on how everyone else should work. She wore a silk blouse that cost more than my first truck. Her fingers were dripping with rings, her hair styled to perfection. Seeing me walk in, she didn't offer a smile. She simply raised a penciled eyebrow and stared at me like a waiter who had brought out the wrong order. "You're late, Harry," she said, her voice sharp and piercing. "We didn't wait for you. The soup is already cold." I looked around the room. Brenda was sitting there, sipping wine. Ryan was scrolling on his phone. Neither of them looked up. There was a place set for me, but it was crammed off to the side, squeezed between the sideboard and a large vase. They had physically displaced me from the head of the table, a symbolic move that wasn't subtle at all. I sat down. Even the chair was different. It was one of the spare folding chairs we used for big parties, not my usual high-backed leather seat. I looked at my plate, a small dry piece of chicken alongside a meager portion of wilted salad. Then I looked at the center of the table. A glass decanter held a deep red wine that was currently breathing. I recognized the label instantly. It was a Chateau Margaux, a specific vintage I had been saving for our upcoming 50th wedding anniversary, a $2,000 bottle. I watched as Brenda poured a full glass for Agnes. The deep crimson liquid swirled smoothly inside the crystal glass. "Looks like we're celebrating," I said, unfolding my napkin. Agnes took a sip, closing her eyes dramatically. "Not bad," she said, smacking her lips. "A bit too much oak, but acceptable. Brenda, dear, pass the rolls." I felt the pulse in my temple pounding hard. "Not bad." She was drinking liquid gold and calling it acceptable. I turned to Brenda. "I thought we were keeping to a strict budget," I said, keeping my voice as flat as possible. "You handed me a prepaid card with $500 for the week. You explicitly told me not to buy cigars, yet here you are drinking a $2,000 bottle of wine on a random Tuesday night." Brenda let out a heavy sigh and set her glass down with a sharp clink. "Oh, Harry, don't start nitpicking. Agnes is a guest here. We're certainly not going to serve her boxed wine. Besides, this bottle was already sitting in the cellar. We didn't spend new money on it. It's inventory." "Inventory?" I repeated. "That was my personal collection. That was meant for our milestone," Ryan chimed in, his mouth full of mashed potatoes. "Don't be so possessive, Dad. It's embarrassing." Agnes let out a short, grating laugh. "Possessive? That's rich coming from you, Harry." She turned her cold, watery eyes directly onto me. "You know, you should really be thanking Brenda. She's saving you from complete financial ruin, yet all you do is complain. You wander in late looking like a transient, and immediately start nickel and diming us over a dinner. It's distinctly low-class behavior." I gripped my fork tightly. I had paid for Agnes's hip replacement. I had paid for her condo down in Florida. When her late husband passed, leaving nothing behind but gambling debts, I paid for his funeral. And now I was low class. "I'm simply asking for consistency, Agnes," I said, forcing myself to swallow a bite of the dried chicken. "If I'm being treated like a child on an allowance, I'd expect the rest of the household to tighten their belts as well." The table went dead silent. Agnes slowly put her fork down. She looked over at Brenda, then at Ryan, and finally locked her gaze on me. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Tighten our belts?" she sneered. "Harry, look at yourself. You're old. You're useless. You don't bring anything to this table anymore. You don't run the company. Ryan does. You don't manage the household. Brenda does. You're nothing more than an extra mouth to feed." She took another sip of my wine, swishing it around in her mouth before swallowing. "You ought to learn your place, Harry," she continued, her voice laced with venom. In the wild, old lions are left behind to starve. We're being generous enough to keep you under this roof, but don't mistake our charity for equality. You're a guest in this house now, and an extraordinarily expensive one at that. I looked over at Brenda, waiting for her to step in and defend me. I waited for her to say, "Mother, stop it. Harry worked 40 years to afford this food." I waited for Ryan to say, "Grandma, that's out of line. He's my father." Neither of them said a word. Brenda kept her head down, looking at her plate with a trace of a smirk, as if she enjoyed watching me be dismantled. Ryan just shook his head with a quiet chuckle, agreeing with every word out of Agnes's mouth. "In fact," Agnes said, leaning forward with glinting eyes, "you're barely even a guest. Guests are invited. You're more like a freeloader. Yes, that's the word. A freeloader living off the success of your wife and son." Freeloader. The word hung in the air like a foul odor. Brenda put a hand over her mouth to cover a giggle. Ryan laughed out loud without hesitation. "Freeloader," he repeated. "Good word, Grandma. The old man is a freeloader." They all laughed, the three of them. Sitting in the home I built, eating the food I bought, drinking the wine I saved, laughing at me, laughing at the man whose calloused hands had paid for every single spoon on that table. I felt something break deep inside me, but it wasn't my spirit. It was the absolute last link of loyalty I held for these people. If I had any lingering doubts, if I had held on to any naive hope that this was all a misunderstanding, it completely evaporated right then and there. You don't call the man who feeds you a freeloader unless you have completely lost your soul. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. As strong as the urge was, I didn't splash the wine in Agnes's face. Instead, I set my fork and knife down neatly beside my plate. I took my linen napkin and wiped my mouth slowly. I looked at them, really looked at them. They were ugly. Maybe not on the surface, but their souls were completely twisted. They were a flock of vultures pecking at a living man, convinced he was already a corpse. "You're right, Agnes," I said softly. The laughter died down, replaced by a confused silence. They had expected me to fight back, to blow up. My calmness threw them off balance. "I'm right?" Agnes asked, her eyes narrowing. "Yes," I said. "I've been coasting. I've let Ryan and Brenda handle far too much of the burden. Maybe I got too comfortable. I suppose I should be grateful that you're all willing to manage my complex wealth while I just sit back." Brenda's shoulders relaxed. She thought I was surrendering. She thought I was accepting defeat. "Well, I'm glad you finally see it that way, Harry," she said, pouring herself more wine. "We only want what's best for everyone." I stood up from the table and picked up my plate. "Where are you going?" Ryan asked. "I'm going to put my plate in the dishwasher," I said, like a good little freeloader should. Wouldn't want to add to the maid's workload. I walked into the kitchen. As the swinging door closed behind me, I heard their conversation pick right back up. Their voices were light, cheerful, already moving on to plan a trip to Italy for the fall, casually spending the fortune they assumed was entirely theirs now. I stood at the sink, staring at the dirty plate. My reflection in the dark window pane looked back at me. I looked exhausted, yes, but I also looked dangerous. Agnes had called me an old lion left behind to starve. She forgot one crucial thing: an old lion is the most lethal kind, because he has nothing left to lose and knows exactly how to hunt in the dark. I washed the plate, dried it, and put it away neatly. Freeloader. I repeated the word in my head, burning it into my mind to use as fuel. In the days ahead, whenever I felt tired, whenever I felt like giving up, I would picture Agnes's face and remember that word. I walked back through the dining room without making eye contact. "Good night," I said. "Good night, Harry," Agnes dismissed casually without turning her head. "Try to get up early tomorrow. Sleeping in is a privilege for people who work." I went upstairs to the guest room I'd been sleeping in for the past month, ever since Brenda claimed my snoring kept her awake. I shut the door and turned the lock. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, I pulled out the prepaid debit card. $500. Then I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper I had pulled from a trash can outside the diner near the office. It had a phone number on it, Frank's sister's number, which I recognized from an old Christmas card years ago. It was a long shot, but it was my only shot. They called me a freeloader. They thought I was completely defenseless. Tomorrow, I was going to show them what a freeloader could do. I was going to make sure that while they drank my wine, I was busy sharpening my blade. Dinner was over, but the game was just getting started. And unlike them, I wasn't fighting for money. I was fighting for my life. The house was dead silent, a rare, heavy quiet that felt like the calm right before a storm. Brenda had left for her weekly $300 spa facial, claiming it was essential for her stress, paid for with funds from the accounts I could no longer access. Ryan had peeled out an hour ago, his Porsche tires screeching down the driveway on his way to some lunch meeting where he'd play the part of the mastermind behind Coleman Construction. Agnes was up in her suite, her heavy snores drifting down the stairwell. I stood in the hallway listening. The grandfather clock I'd brought back from Germany 30 years ago ticked rhythmically. Tick, tock, counting down the remaining time I had to reclaim my life. I knew I had about a 2-hour window. It wasn't much, but for a man who had built skyscrapers on tight deadlines, it was plenty. I walked up to the oak double doors of my home office. My office, I corrected myself mentally. According to them, it was Ryan's office now. He had even installed a brand new digital keypad on the door handle, a high-tech gadget glowing with a soft blue light. He thought he was clever, believing a battery-operated toy would keep me locked out. He forgot I was a builder. He forgot that I knew precisely how those door frames were constructed, because I had installed them with my own 2 hands. I ignored the keypad entirely. Heading to the garage, I grabbed a long, flathead screwdriver and a small pry bar. Returning to the doors, I wedged the screwdriver right into the gap between the frame and the latch mechanism. I leaned into it, feeling the wood give just a bit. I knew the exact sweet spot. With a sudden, firm levering motion, I popped the latch mechanism open. The door groaned and swung inward. I stepped inside. The room smelled completely different now. It used to smell of old paper and leather, but now it reeked of Ryan's overpowering cologne and stale energy drinks. I walked over to the desk, my mahogany desk. Papers were scattered across the top, but I knew the real secrets wouldn't be left out in the open. I tried the drawers. Locked, of course. I focused on the top drawer, the place where I used to store confidential contracts. I jammed the pry bar right underneath the lip of the drawer. I didn't care about the varnish anymore. I didn't care about preserving the finish. The furniture, the house, it was all just wood and stone now. My legacy was the only thing that mattered. I put my weight behind the bar. With a loud crack, the wood splintered, and the lock mechanism snapped open. I pulled the drawer wide. My heart was pounding in my chest, not from fear, but from anticipation. I started sifting through the files. At first, it seemed like standard corporate paperwork. Invoices, payroll runs. But then, tucked away at the very back, under a stack of outdated blueprints, I found a thick manila envelope. It had no label on it whatsoever. I opened it, and the very first document made my blood run cold. It was a draft for a reverse mortgage on our estate. They weren't just taking out a small loan, they were leveraging the full value of the entire property, pulling out every last bit of equity I had planned to pass down to my future grandchildren. Flipping to the next page, I saw a strict timeline attached. The payout date was set for next week. I kept reading, my hands trembling so violently I had to flatten the pages against the desk just to keep them steady. The next document was a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of before, based in Panama. The subject line read, Asset Liquidation and Offshore Transfer. My eyes scanned the text, but my brain initially refused to process the sheer evil of it. It was so calculated, so cold. The letter outlined a systematic plan to liquidate all of Coleman Construction's heavy machinery, cranes, bulldozers, trucks, and sell them off for pennies on the dollar to a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The sole beneficiary of that shell company wasn't the Coleman Family Trust, it was Ryan Coleman. They were hollowing out the business from the inside. They were dismantling everything I'd built like a stolen car in a chop shop. They had no intention of actually running the company. They knew they lacked the skill and ability to win major contracts, so their plan was simple. Strip away every asset, hide the cash in offshore accounts, and let the company collapse into bankruptcy here in the States. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just theft, it was a character assassination. They were wiping out my reputation and destroying the livelihoods of the 200 employees who depended on me. And while they orchestrated this, I'd been sitting in the dining room eating dry chicken, worrying about a $500 weekly allowance. Then came the worst part. At the very bottom of the envelope, I found a crumpled email printout. It was a thread between Ryan and a doctor whose name I recognized, a psychiatrist infamous for offering questionable assessments for the right price. The email read, "The evaluation is set for the 25th. Once you sign the statement declaring Harry incompetent due to advanced dementia, we can expedite the transfer of the power of attorney into full conservatorship. We've identified a state-funded facility that accepts government-subsidized patients. It fits within our budget and will help resolve our immediate cash flow issues." I stared at the paper. A state-funded facility, government-subsidized. They weren't just taking my money. They were planning to throw me into a run-down warehouse for forgotten elderly people. They intended to lock me away in some hellhole, drugging me into submission while they spent my life's work drinking margaritas on a beach in the Caribbean. Tears stung my eyes, hot, angry tears. I had changed Ryan's diapers. I had taught him how to ride a bike. I had bailed him out of his mistakes and carved out a seat for him at my board table. This was my reward, a cheap facility and an early grave. I wiped the tears away. There was no time for grief. Grief was a luxury reserved for people who were safe. Right now, I was in a war zone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap smartphone I had bought with cash at a convenience store yesterday, which I had kept hidden in my sock drawer. I opened the camera. My hands grew completely steady. The anger inside me solidified into something as hard and cold as diamond. Click. I took a clear picture of the mortgage draft. Click. A photo of the Panamanian offshore documents. Click. A shot of the email detailing the psychiatric facility. Page after page, I documented every piece of evidence, ensuring every date, signature, and detail was captured in crisp detail. Just as I went to return the files, something else in the small trash can beside the desk caught my eye. It was a crumpled, glossy brochure. I smoothed it out against my leg. It was a sales catalog for a luxury yacht, with a price circled heavily in red ink, $12 million. Next to the figure, written in Ryan's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Freedom. ETA, 30 days. 30 days. That was their deadline. That was all the time I had before they pulled the trigger on the bankruptcy and sealed me away. I carefully tucked the documents back into the manila envelope and replaced it in the exact spot where I had found it. I pushed the drawer closed. The damaged lock was noticeable if you looked closely, but I gambled on Ryan being too lazy and arrogant to notice. He assumed I was entirely broken and defeated. He could never imagine his freeloader conducting a forensic investigation right in his own office. I pushed my chair back and stood up, taking one final look around the room. It didn't feel like my office anymore. It felt like a crime scene. In a way, it was. They had already put an end to the man who used to be a passive father and husband. I stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind me, using the screwdriver to jam the latch back into a semi-locked position. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. Returning to the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, my throat bone dry. I stared out the window across the expansive lawn, spotting the old swing set I'd built for Ryan when he was 5 years old. It was rusted now, completely overgrown with vines. They wanted to lock me away. They wanted to declare me incompetent. I took a slow sip of water. I checked the clock. Brenda would be back in 20 minutes. I needed to be sitting in the living room holding a newspaper, looking exactly like the confused, obedient old man they expected to see. I walked into the living room and settled into my armchair, opening the paper. I didn't read a single word. My mind was already 3 moves ahead. They had a 30-day plan, but I was going to build my own. And mine didn't end with me in a facility. It ended with them facing full legal accountability. I felt the burner phone in my pocket. It felt heavy, like a loaded weapon. I had the evidence, and now I needed the executioner. I needed Peterson, and I needed to get these photos to him today. The heavy thud of the garage door echoed through the house, signaling Brenda's return. I leaned my head back against the leather armchair and closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. But beneath my eyelids, my mind was sharp and alert. The old lion wasn't sleeping. He was waiting for the precise moment to strike. And when I did, I would ensure they never saw it coming. The rules had shifted. They were playing with money, but I was playing for justice. And justice, I decided, was going to be served cold. I waited until the house settled into a deep afternoon quiet. Brenda was upstairs, likely resting, and the staff were away on their break. I slipped out through the side entrance near the pantry, the one with the door handle that squeaked if you didn't lift it just right. I knew every quirk of this house because I'd paid for every beam and brick. I walked down the long driveway, past the landscaped hedges Ryan claimed were too expensive to maintain, and reached the main road. I didn't drive my Mercedes, nor did I call a cab. I walked to the bus stop once again. The ride into the city was long, but it gave me time to gather my thoughts. I sat near the back, watching the skyline grow larger in the distance. Ryan and Brenda believed my world ended at the estate gates, assuming my influence stopped at the bank accounts they'd managed to freeze. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between being rich and being truly established. Being rich is having a platinum card. Being established is having the institution that issues it. I stepped off the bus in the financial district, but I didn't head toward the polished glass tower, housing Coleman Construction. That building, with its chrome lobby and rude receptionist, was just a storefront, the public face of my operation. It was the playground I had let Ryan manage. Instead, I walked 2 blocks east to a building most people would pass without a second glance. It was a pre-war limestone building with small windows and a heavy iron gate, bearing no flashing signs, just a small polished brass plaque reading 440. I pushed through the heavy doors into the cool, quiet lobby, which smelled of old leather, beeswax, and absolute discretion. There was no background music and no casual receptionist at the desk. A large man in a tailored dark suit stood by the elevator. Seeing me, he immediately stood at attention, asking for no ID or appointment confirmation. He simply gave a respectful nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Coleman," he said quietly. "Good to see you, sir." "Good afternoon, James," I replied. "Is Peterson upstairs?" "He's waiting for you in the conference room, sir. The private elevator's ready." James pressed the call button, and as the door slid shut, separating me from the noise outside, I felt the tension leave my shoulders for the first time in 2 days. In my own house, I was treated like a burden. In my son's office, I was an inconvenience. But here, inside the real engine of my enterprise, I was the head of the firm. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse suite, taking up the entire top floor, the headquarters of HC Holdings, my primary holding entity, whose existence no one in my family knew about. Peterson was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. He turned around as I entered. He was a man of my generation, sharp-minded, wearing a suit that cost more than Ryan's sports car. There was no pity in his eyes, only the focused glare of a strategist waiting for directives. "Harry," he said, stepping forward with a firm handshake, "I got your message. You look like you've been through a war." "They cut off my access," I said, walking toward the large oak conference table. "Peterson, they put me on a $500 weekly allowance, and they're planning to place me in a state facility within 30 days. Peterson's expression hardened. Without a word, he walked over to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of scotch, sliding one across the table toward me. "Drink this," he said. "You're going to need it." I took a sip, the warm liquid sharpening my senses. Reaching into my jacket, I pulled out the cheap burner phone and slid it across the mahogany surface. "The evidence is all in there," I said. "Photos of the mortgage draft, the Panamanian offshore accounts, and the correspondence with that doctor. They're stripping Coleman Construction clean, selling off the equipment, and diverting the funds directly into Ryan's Shell Corporation." Peterson picked up the phone and swiped through the images, his eyebrows rising slightly. "They're sloppy," he muttered, "greedy and incredibly careless. They didn't even bother encrypting the communications. They're running this like a crude smash and grab." He set the phone down and looked directly at me. "So they think they're stealing the company. They think they're taking everything," I corrected. "The house, the vehicles, the entire operation. They think they've won." Peterson let out a sharp, calculated smile. He walked over to a large easel in the corner covered by a drape and pulled the cloth away, revealing a detailed organizational chart. It's time to remind you of what you actually control, Harry, because I suspect, in your generosity, you might have forgotten how thoroughly we protected you. He pointed to a small box near the bottom of the chart labeled Coleman Construction, LLC. This is what Ryan is fighting over, Peterson said. The operating company that builds the bridges and roads. It holds about $30 million in working assets. A solid business, certainly. He paused, moving his pointer to a massive box at the very top of the chart, connected to dozens of radiating lines. And this, Peterson said, lowering his voice, is HC Holdings. I looked at the chart. I built it, of course, but seeing it laid out provided immense clarity. HC Holdings, Peterson continued, is the master entity. It owns 100% of Coleman Construction, but it also owns the land beneath the corporate office. It owns the equipment leasing firm that holds the actual titles to every single crane and bulldozer Ryan is trying to sell. He tapped the board again. And the estate, Harry. Who holds the deed to the property? HC Holdings, I said softly. Exactly, Peterson said. You transferred the title 10 years ago for liability protection. Legally speaking, you and Brenda are merely tenants. You pay zero rent, but you don't hold individual ownership of the structure itself. HC Holdings does. And the vehicles? I asked. Corporate fleet, Peterson replied. Leased to Coleman Construction directly through HC Holdings. He sat down across from me, leaning forward. Do you realize what this means, Harry? Ryan and Brenda are trying to liquidate assets they don't even own. They're attempting to mortgage a property they are merely occupying. They are trying to sell equipment that belongs to a completely separate leasing firm. They aren't criminal masterminds. They're foolish amateur actors who think sitting behind a desk makes them the owners of the building. I stared at the chart representing my true enterprise, a $500 million portfolio spread across real estate, intellectual property, and diversified funds. Coleman Construction, the business Ryan was willing to destroy me for, was just a small fraction of it, representing barely 5% of my total net worth. They have no idea, I said. How could they? Peterson answered. You never told them. You wanted them to build character. You wanted Ryan to work his way up through the construction side to understand the value of honest labor. You never told him that the construction company was just the entry-level branch. A quiet sadness settled in my chest. I had tested them, giving them a small taste of responsibility to see how they would handle it. Instead of growing, they had turned greedy and cruel. I had always hoped the day would come when I could bring Ryan into this very room, unveil the full scope of the enterprise, and hand him the keys to the legacy. That dream was dead now. So, Peterson said, breaking the silence, what we have here is secondary management, your wife and son, engaging in grand corporate fraud and attempted theft against the parent corporation. Yes, I said. And since you are the sole voting shareholder of HC Holdings, they are directly attempting to defraud you. Their actions cross right into federal territory: wire fraud, banking fraud, and conspiracy. Peterson opened a file on the table. I've outlined 2 distinct paths forward, Harry, he said. Path A is measured. We reveal the true corporate structure, show them they own nothing, terminate their positions, sever their access, and leave them to find real work. No prison time, just absolute financial reality. He looked at me intently. And Path B? Path B is the complete legal response, Peterson said. We let them proceed. We let them attempt the sale of the equipment. We let them sign the final mortgage documents. We let every single fraudulent act finalize. The moment the ink dries, we initiate full legal proceedings. We bring in forensic auditors and inform the federal authorities, pressing charges for grand larceny and corporate fraud. We strip them of every asset and ensure they face full accountability under the law. I stared into my glass of scotch, recalling the dinner from the night before. Agnes calling me a burden, Brenda demanding I ask permission for breakfast money, and the facility brochure in Ryan's trash. They had planned zero mercy for me. They intended to lock me away until my dying day, completely erasing my existence for money. I looked up at Peterson. How long until they finalize the equipment transfer? I asked. Based on the emails you captured, the overseas buyer is waiting on the final contract execution. 3 days. 3 days, I repeated. I stood up and walked over to the window, gazing down at the bustling city below. Somewhere down there, Ryan was likely celebrating his newfound control with his friends. "Peterson," I said, my voice completely steady. "Yes, Harry? Prepare Path B," I said, "and I want to be there in person when the authorities step in. I want to look them in the eye when the consequences hit." Peterson gave a single, firm nod and picked up his pen. "We'll need to run a full forensic audit on Coleman Construction's local servers," he noted. "We need to trace every dollar moved over the last 6 months. Can you get us access?" A genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in days. "I hired the head of IT at Coleman Construction 15 years ago," I said. "They assume I'm just an old man who barely knows how to operate a computer. But I personally covered his daughter's medical bills when she was sick. His loyalty lies with me, not Ryan." "Then we have everything we need," Peterson said. I finished my drink, feeling a cold, unstoppable energy surging through me. I was completely ready. "I'm heading back to the house," I said. "I need to keep playing the role of the confused, helpless old man for a few more days. They need to believe they're right, on the verge of total victory." "Just be careful, Harry," Peterson warned, his eyes narrowed with concern. "Desperate people do dangerous things when they're backed into a corner." I slid the burner phone back into my pocket. "They aren't dangerous, Peterson," I said, turning toward the elevator doors. "They're just freeloaders. And I finally found the cure." The machinery was already in motion. The gears were turning and the trap was officially set. They thought they could treat me like a child. They thought they could push me into a corner. Well, they were about to learn the hard way that nobody backs Harry Coleman into a corner. I took the elevator down and stepped back out onto the street. The sun was still shining bright, but for my family, a long, brutal winter was just beginning. They wanted the money, and they wanted the power. They were about to taste the full, crushing weight of it all collapsing right on top of them. Later, I sat in my true executive office at HC Holdings, sinking into the leather armchair of a room my family didn't even know existed. The city skyline stretched out before me, a testament to what focus, discipline, and decades of hard work could build. But my mind wasn't on the view. I was entirely consumed by the betrayal happening inside my own home. Peterson sat across from me, his expression grim as he outlined the legal steps we were taking next. It was ruthless, but absolutely necessary. "You know, Peterson," I said softly, handing them control of Coleman Construction, "it was never about me wanting to retire." Peterson gave a slow nod. "It was a test of loyalty," I answered. "I wanted to see if they could hold a little power without completely losing their souls. I wanted to see if Ryan had the integrity to run a business that supported 200 working families. I wanted to see if Brenda could be a real partner instead of just a spender." I took a deep breath. The air in the room felt heavy. "They failed, Peterson. They failed so spectacularly, it's mind-boggling. I handed them a $30 million company, a goose that laid golden eggs, and their immediate instinct wasn't to feed it. It was to slaughter it and sell the meat." Peterson leaned forward, folding his hands on the polished oak surface. "It's worse than a failure, Harry. It's criminal negligence. And with this offshore scheme exposed, it's outright ongoing fraud. If we don't put a stop to it, they won't just bankrupt the company, they'll drag you down as a co-conspirator." "I know," I said. "That's why the games are over." I picked up the secure line on my desk and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. After 2 sharp rings, a crisp, professional voice answered. "Sterling Security. This is Harry Coleman," I said. "Verification code Alpha 709ER. There was a brief pause before the voice shifted into high alert. "Mr. Coleman, how can we serve you, sir?" "I need the ghost team," I said. "Tonight. Target the local servers at Coleman Construction for a complete forensic audit. I want every email, every transaction, and every deleted file from the last 6 months, and I need it done without triggering a single internal alarm." "Understood, sir. Our team will be inside the system within the hour. Do we have authorization to bypass the CFO's firewalls?" "You have authorization to burn those firewalls to ash if necessary," I said. "Just bring me the hard evidence. I want to know where every single penny went, who signed the checks, and who authorized the transfer of our equipment. Consider it done. I hung up the phone. Peterson watched me with a mix of respect and quiet concern. You've unleashed the hounds, he said. They aren't hounds, Peterson, I said, standing up and walking to the window. They're surgeons. They're going to cut out the infection rotting my company. Ryan thinks he's brilliant because he hired a kid to run a paper shredder. He doesn't realize that digital footprints never disappear. He thinks he can hide cash in the Caymans, unaware that my people can find a single dime dropped in a desert. I turned back to face him. That's the part that stings the most, Peterson. Ryan is my son. I changed his diapers, taught him how to throw a baseball, and bailed him out when he made mistakes as a teenager. I kept holding out hope that he'd grow up and become a real man. Peterson poured another splash of scotch into my glass. Some boys never grow up, Harry. They just get older and a lot more expensive. I took the glass, staring into the amber liquid without taking a drink. I remember when he was 10 years old, I said softly. He stole a piece of candy from the corner store. I made him walk back, return it, and apologize to the owner face to face. He cried and said he was sorry. I genuinely believed he learned never to take what wasn't his. I swirled the glass. Now he's trying to steal a $30 million company without a shred of remorse. All he has left is pure greed. And Brenda isn't a victim here either. She's the architect. She's the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes, demanding a life of unearned luxury. I set the glass down with a sharp clink against the desk. Enough nostalgia. We have work to do. Peterson opened his laptop. The audit team will need about 24 hours to build the complete file, he said. They'll trace the money flow, map the shell corporations, and match the wire timestamps to Ryan's login activity. By tomorrow night, we'll have a file strong enough to put them away for 20 years. Good, I said. But I need more than financial ledgers. I need physical proof of the conspiracy. I need them tied directly to that psychiatrist. I need absolute proof that they plan to declare me incompetent. The team is scraping their private email servers as well, Peterson assured me. If they use corporate devices or the home Wi-Fi, we'll recover it all. I nodded as a cold resolve settled over me. The grief was gone, replaced by the crystal-clear focus I always felt when a massive job needed doing. What about the banks? I asked. I've already drafted the notices, Peterson said. The moment you give the signal, we freeze every asset linked to Coleman Construction. We alert the lenders that the mortgage applications are fraudulent, and we notify the authorities in the Caymans that incoming transfers are proceeds of crime. Hold off on that, I instructed. Let the audit finish first. I want them to feel safe for just a few more days. I want them to sign those final documents and lock in the paper trail of their crime. Peterson raised an eyebrow. That's risky, Harry. If they move the funds fast enough, they won't, I interrupted. They're arrogant. They think I'm a senile old man worrying about breakfast money. They think you're completely out of the picture. They believe time is on their side. I walked over to the organizational chart Peterson had shown me earlier, tracing the line from HC Holdings down to Coleman Construction. I built this with my own sweat and blood, I said. I won't let them tear it down for a quick payday. I looked at Peterson. When this is over, Peterson, I'm making changes. Big changes. What kind of changes? He asked. I'm bringing back the people who actually care about this work, I said, starting with Frank. I'm going to ask him to come back, and I'm going to look for hungry young builders who want to create something real, not spoiled kids waiting around for an inheritance. Peterson smiled. Sounds like a solid plan, Harry. I checked my watch. It was time to head back to the estate, put on the mask of the confused, broken father, and sit at that dinner table listening to their lies. I'd have to watch them spend my money and insult my intelligence, playing the hardest role of my life. I grabbed my coat. Peterson, I said at the door, make sure the audit team checks the jewelry purchases. Jewelry? Peterson asked. Yes, I said. Brenda's been wearing a new diamond bracelet, and my daughter-in-law had a brand new watch on. I have a feeling those weren't bought with their personal savings. I'll add it to the list, Peterson said. I stepped out of the office and into the private elevator. As the doors closed, a strange sense of quiet settled over me. The trap was set, and the gears were turning. They wanted to treat me like a child and push me into a corner. but they were about to learn that no one backs Harry Coleman into a corner. Reaching the lobby, I gave a brief nod to James, the security guard. "Have a good evening, Mr. Coleman," he said. "I will, James," I replied. "I certainly will." I stepped out into the cool evening air. The city lights were turning on, casting a brilliant glow across the skyline. I caught the bus back to the suburbs, sitting in the very last row, observing the people around me. Honest, hard-working folks earning their living. I felt far closer to them than to my own family. After getting off at my stop, I walked the final mile to the estate. My legs were tired, but my spirit was surging. I walked up the long driveway. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree, and I could see silhouettes moving around in the dining room. They were likely opening another bottle of my fine wine, raising a toast to their apparent success. I slipped inside through the side door. Their laughter echoed down the hall, sharp, shrill, and entirely hollow. Walking into the kitchen, I found Marco, our chef, preparing dessert. He was a good man, and he looked at me with sympathetic eyes. "Mr. Coleman," he whispered softly, "would you like some dinner? I saved a plate of prime rib for you before they finished." "Thank you, Marco," I said, patting his shoulder gently. "You're a good man." I took the plate and skipped the dining room entirely, heading up the back staircase to my room. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I ate the cold prime rib. It tasted delicious. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Peterson. "The team is in. Data extraction underway. It's worse than we thought." A tight smile touched my lips. Let it be worse, I thought. The worse it is, the harder they fall. Finishing my food, I leaned back against the pillows and closed my eyes. Downstairs, I could hear Ryan's boastful voice carrying up the stairs. "To the future!" he shouted. I whispered into the dark room, "Yes, son, to the future, a future without you in it." The scratch of my fountain pen across the heavy paper was the only sound in the room. It was a steady, rhythmic sound, like a blade being sharpened. I was sitting in a private conference room at the bank. The floors were marble, and the ceilings were so high they made a man feel small. But I didn't feel small today. I felt completely in control. Across from me sat Mr. Sterling, the senior vice president of commercial lending. He'd known me for 30 years, a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried because he had financed the shovels. He watched with professional detachment as I signed the final page, though I could see the sharp curiosity in his eyes. "There," I said, capping the pen with a satisfying click. "That secures the property deeds." Mr. Sterling pulled the stack of documents toward him, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the signatures. "So, for the record, Harry, you are confirming that the residential property at 4400 Lakeview Drive and the commercial building at 101 Industrial Way remain the exclusive assets of HC Holdings." "Correct," I said, leaning back into the leather chair. "And," Sterling continued, lowering his voice slightly, "you confirm that the current occupants of the residence, namely Brenda Coleman, Ryan Coleman, and their immediate families, have no legal claim to the title and are, in fact, tenants at will." "They are guests," I corrected, my voice cold. "Guests who have overstayed their welcome and guests who violated their stay by attempting to sell off the owner's property." Sterling gave a slow nod and stamped the top document. The red ink stood out like a stain on the white paper. "Then the next document is legally binding." He slid a single sheet across the mahogany table. It was a notice to vacate, a standard brutal form. It gave the occupants exactly 60 minutes to gather their personal belongings and leave the premises before the locks were changed and law enforcement was brought in. 60 minutes to pack up a lifetime of lies. I stared at the paper, thinking of the house. I had designed every inch of it, picked out the foyer marble, and chosen the exact spot in the garden where Ryan used to play as a kid. Signing that paper felt like tearing down a piece of my own history. But they had already ruined it. They had turned my home into a nest of thieves. I picked up the pen again, my hand hovering over the signature line. For a fraction of a second I hesitated, seeing the face of my son as a little boy, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes. Then that memory was wiped clean by the image of the man sitting in my office, laughing while plotting to ship me off to a state facility. The hesitation vanished. I signed my name in sharp, jagged strokes. "The eviction order is ready," Sterling said, sliding the paper into a confidential folder. Now, regarding the lines of credit. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the tightening of the noose. I want a total freeze, I said. Sterling opened his laptop and typed in a sequence of security codes. Let's review the exposure. Brenda has a black card tied to the primary HC Holdings operating account. Ryan has a corporate platinum card, along with 3 supplementary cards for his wife and personal expenses. They also have access to the primary corporate travel and entertainment accounts. Unlimited, I muttered. They thought money fell from the sky. As of this morning, their combined spending for the month is over $80,000, Sterling noted, looking at the screen. Mostly high-end retail, jewelry, and a deposit on a villa rental in Tuscany. Tuscany! I let out a dry laugh. They hadn't even won the prize, yet they were already planning the victory lap. I want a complete kill switch, I instructed. Every card, every line of credit, and every digital access code terminated at the exact same time. Don't just decline the transactions for insufficient funds. Have the system flag the cards as stolen. Instruct the merchants to confiscate the physical cards if they attempt to use them. Sterling typed for a moment, then looked up. We can arrange that. When do you want the freeze to go live? I checked my watch, calculating the timeline in my head. Peterson's team would wrap up the forensic audit by morning, and the overseas buyer expected to sign the equipment deal by afternoon. Ryan and Brenda would feel completely invincible. They would be ready to celebrate. Tomorrow at noon, I said. 12 o'clock sharp. That's ground zero. Sterling nodded. Ground zero it is. At noon tomorrow, they will be completely cut off financially. They won't even be able to buy a pack of gum. And the mortgage applications? I asked. Flagged, Sterling confirmed. The second they attempt to execute the documents for the reverse mortgage or the equipment sale, a fraud alert will trigger. The bank will block the transaction and notify the authorities immediately. You've surrounded them, Harry. This is a total siege. It is a siege, I said. And they don't even know the walls have already fallen. I stood up, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and cold focus. Going after your own family is a terrible thing, but when they turn into predators, it becomes an absolute necessity. Thank you, Sterling, I said, extending my hand. He shook it firmly. Good luck, Harry. I hope you get the closure you need. I walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon sun and hailed a cab. I couldn't risk taking the bus today. I needed to get back to the estate and get into position. The ride was a blur as I rehearsed the next 24 hours in my mind. I pictured Brenda's face when a waiter at her favorite lunch spot handed her back a card cut in half. I imagined Ryan's panic as he tried to sign the closing documents, only to have attorneys look at him with sharp suspicion. When we arrived at the estate, the gates opened automatically for the cab. I watched the house come into view, grand and imposing against the blue sky. But I knew it was nothing more than a house of cards, and I had just pulled out the bottom card. I paid the driver in cash and walked up to the front door, using my key to step inside. The main hall was in complete chaos. Designer suitcases were stacked high near the entryway. I walked into the living room. Brenda was bossing the maid around, directing her on how to pack a crate of fine crystal. Ryan was pacing back and forth on the phone, looking thrilled. Dad! Ryan called out when he saw me. He actually smiled, a genuine one, or at least a very good fake. You're back early. I just took a walk, I lied, keeping my voice raspy and weak. Sat in the park for a bit. That's nice, Brenda said, not bothering to look up from the crystal. Just stay out of the way, Harry. We're busy packing for a little trip. A trip? I asked, shuffling into the room and perching on the edge of a chair. Yeah, Ryan said, ending his call. We're heading to Italy for a few weeks to celebrate closing a massive deal. He flashed a quick wink at Brenda, and she offered a triumphant smirk. Sounds expensive, I said, clutching my hands tightly together to hide that they were balled into fists. Don't worry about the money, Dad, Ryan said, walking over and patting my shoulder. It was a condescending pat, the kind you give a dog. We've got everything under control. Business is finally booming. We're going to be very, very comfortable. I looked up into my son's eyes, watching them gleam with pure greed. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours he would be completely broke. He had no idea the credit cards in his pocket were ticking time bombs. I'm happy for you, Ryan, I said. I really am. And I meant it. I was glad his true nature was exposed so completely. It made what I had to do next infinitely easier. Just make sure you pack everything you need, I added softly. You never know when you'll get to come back. They ignored me, resuming their packing while discussing first-class seats and five-star hotels, casually spending the money they had stolen from me. I stood up and headed toward the stairs. Where are you going? Brenda called out. To my room, I said. I'm tired. I need a nap. Go ahead, she dismissed. Just make sure you're up for dinner. We ordered lobster, one last feast before we leave. Lobster, paid for with my money. I walked up the stairs, every step feeling heavy. But it was a good kind of heavy. The weight of a judge's gavel right before delivering a sentence. Stepping into my room, I closed the door, walked over to the window, and looked out over the courtyard. Ground zero. Tomorrow at noon. I checked my watch. 18 hours to go. I would let them eat their lobster, drink my wine, and sleep on my silk sheets one last time. Because when they woke up tomorrow, their world was going to be completely inverted. I sat on the bed, pulled the eviction notice from my inner pocket, and smoothed it out. Notice to vacate. I set it gently on the nightstand, right beside a framed family photo taken 10 years ago. We were all smiling in it, looking completely happy. I turned the frame face down. That family was dead, and the people downstairs were strangers. Tomorrow, I was going to introduce them to the real owner of the house. The early morning sun cut sharp rays through the blinds of my secret office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. I hadn't slept a wink, staring at the ceiling all night, listening to the quiet while waiting for the dawn that would bring the end of the family I used to know. At 8 o'clock sharp, the heavy oak door opened, and Peterson walked in. He didn't knock, unlike the skittish employees Ryan had hired. He carried a thick black binder under his arm like a prosecutor carrying evidence to a trial. He set the binder down on the desk in front of me. The heavy thud echoed off the walls, a sound of final judgment. It's done, Peterson said, his voice completely neutral. The forensic team worked through the night. We have everything. I stared at the black cover, hesitating to open it. As long as it remained shut, a small, foolish part of me hoped this was all a massive misunderstanding, that my son was just incompetent, not a criminal, and my wife was just spoiled, not a thief. But I knew the truth. Reaching out, I flipped the cover open. The first page was a summary, the numbers printed in bold red ink. Total unauthorized transfers, $4,200,000. I felt a sharp punch to my chest. 4.2 million stolen in 6 months. I turned the page to the detailed breakdown. Ryan had been busy setting up a fake vendor called RC Logistics, submitting $50,000 weekly payments from Coleman Construction for consulting fees, paying a company that didn't exist. He didn't even bother to cover his tracks properly, Peterson noted, pointing to a line on the spreadsheet. He used his personal home address for the shell company. He assumed you'd never check, believing he was smarter than the system. I traced my finger over those printed letters. Ryan Coleman, my son. The boy who used to ask me for $5 to go to the movies was now stealing $50,000 a week from his own father. It gets worse, Peterson said, his voice flat. Turn to Section 3. I flipped through a few pages. Section 3 was labeled with the name Megan Coleman, my daughter-in-law, the woman who smiled at me every Thanksgiving and told me how much she admired my work ethic. The page was covered in credit card statements from the corporate American Express account. Tiffany & Co., $40,000. Cartier, $65,000. Van Cleef and Arpels, $120,000. She listed those as office supplies, Peterson said, dripping with disgust. She bought a diamond necklace and categorized it as printer toner. She bought a Rolex and labeled it as employee training expenses. A cold, hard anger settled deep in my gut. It wasn't about the money. I had plenty of that. It was the absolute disrespect. They believed I was so foolish and blind that I couldn't tell the difference between a diamond necklace and a box of toner. Every time they swiped that card, they were laughing at me. Here's the smoking gun, Peterson said, turning to the very last section of the binder. It was a copy of a wire transfer application dated for today. $12 million. This is the payout from the heavy equipment sale, Peterson explained. They are selling the cranes, bulldozers, and excavators, stripping the company completely bare. The money is scheduled to be wired to a bank in the Cayman Islands at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I checked my watch. It was 9 in the morning. They're cutting it close, I said. They're desperate, Peterson replied. They know the company is bleeding out because of their theft. They need this sale to cover their tracks and fund their escape to Italy. If this wire goes through, the business is dead, and 200 people lose their livelihoods. It's not going through, I said, closing the binder firmly. No, Peterson agreed. It isn't, because we're going to stop them. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a smaller folder containing 3 arrest warrants. I had to call in a major favor with a prosecutor, Peterson said. Based on the evidence in that binder, a judge signed these an hour ago. Grand larceny, wire fraud, and conspiracy to embezzle. I looked at the names on the warrants. Ryan Coleman, Brenda Coleman, Megan Coleman, my family, my wife, my son, and my daughter-in-law. I picked up the papers. They felt light, but the weight behind them was crushing. I was about to send my entire family to prison, leaving myself completely alone. Are you certain you want to go through with this, Harry? Peterson asked softly. Once we execute these, there's no turning back. You can still call it off. You could just fire them, throw them out, and avoid locking them up. I stood up and walked over to the window, taking one last look down at the city. I thought back to the dinner table, remembering Agnes calling me a burden, Brenda making me beg for breakfast money, and the facility brochure in Ryan's trash. They had planned zero mercy for me. Peterson, I said, my voice as solid as steel, they intended to lock me away and erase me. If I let them off, they'll just move on to their next victim and do the exact same thing. Ryan would teach his own children to act like this. I turned around to face him. No, the cycle stops right now. I walked back to the desk, picked up the black binder, and held it tight. It was my weapon, and it was my shield. What's the plan? Peterson asked. I checked my watch. It's 9:30. They're at the house right now packing for Italy, thinking they're flying out tonight and expecting the money this afternoon. I slid the warrants into my inner coat pocket. I'm going home, I said. I'm going to ask them for breakfast money one last time. I'm giving them one final chance to show a shred of humanity. One last chance to confess. And if they don't? Peterson asked. Then we execute the warrants, I said. Have the police on standby right down the street. When I give the signal, I want them coming through that front door. What's the signal? Peterson asked. I'll send you a text, I said. Just one word. Justice. Peterson gave a single nod, looking at me with a mix of sadness and respect. You're a strong man, Harry, he said. Stronger than I could ever be. I'm not strong, Peterson, I said, moving toward the door. I'm just a builder. When a structure is rotten at its core, you don't just put a fresh coat of paint on it. You tear it down. I stepped out of the office, the binder heavy under my arm. Taking the elevator down felt like descending into the underworld. I stepped out onto the street and hailed a cab. To the suburbs, I told the driver, and step on it. As the city faded behind us, I opened the binder again and looked at the photo of the diamond necklace Megan had bought. It was beautiful, and it was going to look great sitting in an evidence locker. I looked at the $12 million transfer form. Freedom, Ryan had written on the brochure. He was right. He was buying freedom, but not for himself. He was buying it for me. Freedom from his lies, freedom from his greed, and freedom from the burden of trying to save a son who didn't want to be saved. The cab pulled up to the estate gates, which were standing wide open. I saw a moving truck parked in the driveway. They weren't just taking clothes. They were clearing out furniture and paintings, running a final looting before tearing the place down. I paid the driver and got out. The sun was bright, and the birds were singing. A beautiful morning for a funeral. I walked up the driveway, my heart pounding steadily in my chest. Reaching the front door, I found it wide open, with upbeat, loud music blasting from inside. They were already celebrating. I gripped the binder tightly and crossed the threshold. The lion was home, and the hunt was over. I walked into the living room, where the air was thick with expensive perfume, and the crisp scent of brand-new leather luggage. The space looked like an executive lounge, with designer suitcases lined up near the door, ready for a first-class flight to Rome. Brenda held a glass of champagne, her face flushed with excitement from spending money she hadn't earned. Ryan was showing Megan pictures of the villa they had rented in Tuscany, a massive estate that cost more for a single week than most honest people earned in a year. Agnes sat in my favorite armchair like a queen on a throne, criticizing the maid for not packing her silk scarves properly. They were so happy, so incredibly confident. When they saw me walk in, their smiles didn't fade, but they shifted into pure mockery. I was a stain on their perfect picture, an old dog that needed to be put outside so the party could continue. I stopped in the middle of the room, letting my shoulders slump, my hands shake at my sides, and my eyes look watery and confused. I had to play this final scene, making them believe I was completely broken. "Brenda," I started, my voice cracking right on cue, sounding pitiful. "I need to talk to you." Brenda let out a sigh and rolled her eyes at Megan. She took a slow sip of champagne before turning to me. "What is it now, Harry? Can't you see we're busy? The car will be here in an hour." "It's about breakfast," I said, looking down at my shoes. "I went to the store to get some eggs, but I think I lost the card you gave me. I can't find it anywhere." Ryan let out a sharp laugh. "You lost it? Dad, there was $500 on that. Do you have any idea how irresponsible that is?" "I'm sorry," I mumbled. I'm hungry, Brenda. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Could you just give me $20 so I can get some pancakes at the diner?" The room went completely still. This was the moment of total submission, begging for $20 inside a multi-million-dollar home. Brenda set her glass down and walked toward me, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She stopped just inches from my face, smelling of aged wine and arrogance. $20? She repeated softly. "Yes, please," I said, "just 20. She let out a cruel smile. "No." I looked up at her, pretending to be shocked. "No." "I told you, Harry," she said, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "I told you that you needed to learn discipline. You think money grows on trees? You think you can just lose your allowance and come begging to me? Let this be a lesson. If you lose the card, you don't eat. Maybe going hungry will help you remember where you put it." "But Brenda," I pleaded, reaching out a trembling hand toward her arm. She pulled back sharply. "I'm your husband. You're a burden," she spat. "You're a giant child in an old man's body, and I am sick of taking care of you." Agnes chimed in from her chair, her voice grating. "That's right, Brenda. Hold your ground. If you give him money now, he'll never learn. Without money, a man is nothing but noise. Keep him broke, and you keep him obedient. That's how you train a dog, and that's how you train a husband." Ryan walked over, shaking his head. "Dad, honestly, this is embarrassing. You're making a scene. Just go to your room, and we'll leave some crackers for you before we head to the airport." "Crackers?" I looked at them. Ryan, my son. Megan, wearing a diamond necklace bought with stolen company funds. Brenda, my wife of 40 years. And Agnes, the leech I had supported for decades. They were enjoying every second of it, feeding off my humiliation because it made them feel powerful and justified their actions. In their minds, I was weak, so I deserved to be crushed. I looked over at the grandfather clock in the corner. The minute hand clicked right to the top. 12 o'clock. Ground zero. I took a deep breath, held it for a second, and let it out. Then came the sound of their future crashing down. Brenda's phone went off first, a sharp, loud ping, followed immediately by another, starting a machine gun volley of vibrations against the table. Then Ryan's phone started buzzing in his pocket, and Megan's smartwatch lit up. Brenda frowned, picking up her device. "Who is texting me this much?" she muttered. She unlocked the screen, her eyes going wide as her mouth opened without making a sound. "What is it?" Ryan asked, pulling out his own phone. His face drained of color as he stared at the screen, swiping and tapping frantically. "My card," Ryan stammered. I just got an alert. The corporate card I used for the villa deposit was declined. They say the payment was reversed." "That's impossible," Brenda snapped. "I checked the balances this morning." She tapped her screen again. "It says the accounts are frozen," she whispered in horror. "Flagged for fraud. Contact the issuing institution immediately." Megan gasped loudly. "Mine too. I just tried to request a car, and it says the payment method is invalid. What is going on? Did the banking system crash?" Ryan looked up, panic fully setting in. "It's got to be a system glitch. I'm calling the bank." He dialed the number and put it on speaker. The automated voice echoed through the hall, cheerful and loud. "We're sorry. The account ending in 4590 has been flagged for criminal activity and is currently under federal investigation. If you are the account holder, please remain on the line for law enforcement." Ryan dropped his phone onto the floor with a heavy thud. "Criminal activity?" Agnes gasped. "What did you do, you idiot? Did you trigger an audit?" "I didn't do anything," Ryan yelled. "We were careful." I stood up straight, dropping the helpless act entirely. I stood like the man who built skyscrapers, my spine straight and my hands completely still. In one smooth motion, I buttoned my coat jacket. I looked at them, letting the mask fall away. My eyes were clear, cold, and hard as granite. "It isn't a glitch, Ryan," I said, my voice deep and ringing through the room. They all turned to look at me, completely baffled, as if looking at a total stranger. "Harry," Brenda said, her voice shaking, "what are you talking about?" I walked over to the table with the champagne bottle, picked it up, and looked at the label. "You told me I had to beg for every penny, Brenda," I said calmly. "You told me that without money I was nothing but noise." I turned the bottle over and poured the expensive champagne onto the floor, watching it splash and fizz against the Persian rug. "Well, I have some bad news for you," I continued. "You're the ones who are broke." "Dad," Ryan said, stepping forward to try and regain control. "Dad, stop it. Did you call the bank? Did you mess with the accounts? You have no idea what you're doing. You're going to ruin the trip." I turned my gaze sharply onto him, the sheer pressure stopping him in his tracks. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, "because I am the primary account holder. I am the chairman of the board, and I just cut off your supply." "What do you mean?" Brenda whispered. "I mean the cards in your hands are worthless plastic," I said. "I mean the villa in Italy is gone, and the first-class tickets have been canceled." "You can't do that," Megan yelled. "We are authorized users." "You were authorized users on the accounts of HC Holdings," I barked. "My company, my money. And as of 12 o'clock today, HC Holdings has terminated all access due to severe fraud and theft." "Theft?" Agnes gasped. "How dare you?" I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy black binder Peterson had given me. Instead of handing it to them, I tossed it across the room. It spun through the air and hit Ryan right in the chest, making him stumble back. "Open it," I ordered. Ryan's hands were shaking for real now. He opened the binder, seeing the red numbers, the list of shell companies, and the emails he thought were long deleted. "How?" he whispered. "How did you get this?" "You thought I was senile," I said, stepping closer. "You thought I was a helpless old man who only cared about gardening and naps. You forgot who I am, son. I taught you how to read, and I just read your entire playbook." I looked at Brenda, who was pale as a sheet, holding onto the sofa for support. "You were going to put me in a facility, Brenda," I said softly. "A state-funded house. You were going to drug me and forget about me while you spent my life's work." "Harry, no, that was just a backup plan," she stammered. "Liar!" I roared, the sound echoing off the walls. Right on cue, another sound joined in, heavy blaring sirens rushing up the driveway. Not just one car, but three. They froze, every drop of color leaving their faces. I walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open. Peterson was standing there, backed by 4 police officers and 2 federal agents in dark suits wearing badges. Peterson stepped inside, looking at the luggage, the spilled champagne, and my family cowering like cornered animals. "Mr. Coleman," Peterson said, "are they all here?" "Yes, Peterson," I said, "the whole group." An agent stepped forward. "Ryan Coleman, Brenda Coleman, Megan Coleman, I have warrants for your arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, and conspiracy to embezzle." Agnes let out a loud shriek, not of fear, but of pure rage. "You can't do this. We are the Colemans." "Not anymore," I said. The officers moved in immediately, and the room descended into utter chaos. Handcuffs clicked sharply into place. Megan began crying loudly, begging me to tell them it was all a mistake. Brenda tried to pull away, screaming that she was my wife. "Harry!" Brenda yelled. "Harry, tell them! Tell them we were just managing the funds." I just watched them as the officers searched their pockets and pulled away my son, who was crying like a child. I walked right up to Ryan while the officer held him. He looked at me, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please," he sobbed. "Please don't do this. I'm your son." I looked him dead in the eye. My son would never try to sell my company behind my back, I said. My son would never call me a burden. You're not my son. You're just a thief who shares my last name. I turned to the officer. Take them away. They were dragged out the door, their cries fading as they were placed into the back of the police cars. Agnes was left behind, sitting alone in her armchair, untouched by the officers but completely broken. She looked tiny, fragile, and old. I looked at her. You said earlier that without money, a man is nothing but noise, Agnes, I noted. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Well, I said, buttoning my coat, I have all the money now, and you're about to become very, very quiet. I turned to Peterson. Serve the eviction notice, I instructed. She has 60 minutes to pack. If she isn't off the property by 1 o'clock, call the sheriff. I stepped out onto the porch, watching the police cars drive away with the people who had tried to destroy me. I took a deep breath of the fresh afternoon air. Reaching into my pocket, I touched the prepaid card with the $500 on it. I still had it. I turned to Peterson. Peterson, I said. Yes, Harry? I'm starving. Let's go get some pancakes. My treat. Peterson smiled. My pleasure, Harry. We walked down the steps, leaving the empty house behind. The war was over, and for the first time in a long time, the lion was completely satisfied. The metallic click of those handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard in that house, slicing right through the sobbing and screaming. I watched as the officer pulled Ryan's arms behind his back. My son, a man who had spent his whole life wearing soft suits and sitting in comfortable chairs, winced hard as the cold steel touched his wrists. He looked at me with a level of terror I'd never seen in him before. The fear of a man realizing the safety net he had relied on his entire life was suddenly gone. Dad, please, Ryan stammered, his face pressed near the Persian rug where I'd spilled the champagne. You have to stop this. It's a misunderstanding. I can fix it. I can return the money. We can work this out. I looked down at him, feeling no anger left inside, just a deep, hollow exhaustion. You can't fix this, Ryan, I said quietly. When trust is shattered, you can't just put it back together. A father's love, once you sell it off for a villa in Tuscany, is gone for good. The officer pulled him to his feet. Ryan stumbled, his expensive Italian loafers slipping on the wet floor. He looked small, like a total stranger. You have the right to remain silent, the officer recited in a flat, professional tone. I suggest you use that right, Ryan, I said. You've said far too much already. Across the room, Megan was hysterical, trying to pull her wrists away from a female officer, yelling about her rights and claiming harassment. The officer remained unfazed, turning her around and pinning her against the wall. Ma'am, stop resisting, the officer warned clearly. Wait, I said, stepping forward. The room went quiet, and Megan looked at me with a flash of hope in her eyes, assuming I was stepping in to save her. That soft-hearted old Harry was back. I walked up to her and pointed a finger at her neck. That necklace, I said, the diamond pendant, bought on March 12th using corporate funds. It's evidence of stolen property. The officer nodded and unclasped the necklace. Megan gasped as the cold air hit her skin, and the officer dropped the jewelry into a plastic evidence bag with a dull thud. And the watch, I added. The Rolex. That's corporate property, too. As those items were stripped away, Megan completely broke down. Without them, she looked entirely exposed, just a greedy girl who had reached into the wrong pocket. Then came Brenda. My wife didn't scream or fight. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands over her mouth, staring directly at me. When the federal agent approached, she flinched, but she didn't run. She just kept looking at me. Harry, she whispered, her voice trembling. Harry, 40 years. We've been married for 40 years. You can't send me to prison. I'm your wife. I looked at her, seeing the woman I had built this life for, the person I had shared my secrets, fears, and dreams with. I also saw the woman who had sat in this exact room yesterday, making me beg for $20. You were my wife, Brenda, I said firmly. But a wife doesn't plan to lock her husband away in a state facility. A wife doesn't plot to declare him incompetent just to strip away his life's work. The moment you signed those papers, you stopped being my wife. Now you're just an accomplice. Please, she begged, tears running down her face and ruining her makeup. I was scared. I was worried about the future. No, I said. You were just greedy. You wanted the lifestyle without the man. Now you lose both. The agent took her by the arm, and she let out a low, desperate wail. They led her past me, and she reached out a hand to grab my sleeve, but I took a step back and let her pass. I watched them walk out the front door, the red and blue lights of the police cruisers flashing off the hallway walls. The house fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of one remaining person, Agnes. My mother-in-law was still sitting in the armchair, unmoved, looking like a melting wax statue. She was pale, staring blankly at the open door where her daughter and grandson had just been taken away, her hands gripping the armrests so hard her knuckles were yellow. She wasn't in handcuffs. She had been careful never to sign a check or send an email. She was the whisper, spreading venom, encouraging the wrongdoing while keeping her hands off the physical evidence. I walked over to her, with Peterson following closely and pulling a sheet of paper from his briefcase. Agnes looked up at me, her lips moving without sound at first, before she found her raspy voice. "You monster," she hissed. "You destroyed this family." I let out a short, dry laugh. "I didn't destroy anything, Agnes. I just threw out the trash." Peterson stepped forward, holding out the paper. Agnes refused to take it, so Peterson placed it gently on her lap. "Mrs. Miller," Peterson said in a cold, professional tone, "this is an official notice to vacate. As the legal representative of HC Holdings, the owner of this property, I am informing you that your tenancy is terminated immediately." Agnes looked at the paper, then back up at me, her voice rising in disbelief. "You're throwing me out? I'm an 80-year-old woman. Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't know, Agnes," I said. "And frankly, I don't care. Maybe you can check into that budget-friendly facility Brenda picked out for me. I hear they have an open bed." Her jaw dropped. "You have 60 minutes, Peterson said, checking his watch. "You may take your personal clothing and toiletries. Any items purchased using Coleman construction funds must remain here. If you are not off the premises by 1 o'clock, the sheriff's deputies waiting outside will remove you for trespassing." "60 minutes?" she shrieked. "That's impossible." "Then you'd better start packing right now," I said. I turned my back on her and walked over to the window to watch the scene outside. The neighbors had come out of their homes, standing on their lawns as Ryan and Brenda were loaded into the back of the police cruisers, a complete and total public humiliation. I heard Agnes scrambling out of her chair behind me, cursing and muttering awful things about me as she dragged her suitcases toward the stairs. She moved faster than I'd ever seen her move before. Fear truly is a powerful motivator. I stood there for an entire hour listening to the sound of my house being cleared out, the sound of frantic zipping, and the dull thuds of suitcases being dragged down the steps. At 12:55, Agnes appeared in the hallway, dragging 2 large bags, drenched in sweat, with her hair messily out of place. She gave me one final look, filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I hope you rot in this big empty house," she spat. "You're going to die all alone." I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of calm. "I'd rather die alone than live with snakes," I said. She stormed out the door, dragging her bags, with Peterson following to ensure she cleared the property. I watched her struggle down the driveway, a bitter woman who had gambled everything on her daughter's greed and lost it all. When she reached the gate, Peterson shut the door behind her, and the automatic lock clicked firmly into place. It was over. The police cars were gone, the neighbors had satisfied their curiosity and gone back inside, and the driveway was empty. I turned back around to face the room. It was a mess, with champagne drying on the rug and furniture knocked out of place. Yet the air felt light. The crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest for months was completely gone. Peterson walked back inside, looking at me and nodding. "They're gone, Harry. The house is yours." I looked around the massive space, far too big for one man, but for the first time in years, it actually felt like mine again. It no longer felt like a fortress of pressure and expectations. It felt like a clean slate. "Thank you, Peterson," I said. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. I walked over to the table, picked up the phone Brenda had dropped, and set it down on a side table. "I want to sit down," I said. "I want to sit in my chair right at the head of the long table. And then I want to drink a cup of coffee that I paid for myself." Peterson smiled. "I think there should be some in the kitchen." I walked into the dining room and pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one they had moved off to the side earlier. I dragged it right back where it belonged and sat down, feeling the solid wood beneath me. I was all alone. My family was behind bars, my marriage was over, and by any standard measure, I should have been completely crushed. But as I sat there in the silence, I realized something important. I hadn't lost a family. I had survived an infection. I had cut out the rot before it had a chance to destroy me completely. I reached into my pocket and touched the $500 debit card. They had told me I was worthless without them, but they were dead wrong. I had immense value, and now I had the rest of my life to prove it. I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. Checkmate. 3 months passed. 3 months since the day those police cars drove down my driveway with their lights flashing. 3 months since the deafening silence of that empty house was replaced by a sweet, peaceful sense of order. I sat in my real executive office at HC Holdings, the high-rise suite overlooking the city like a quiet fortress. The view today was breathtaking. Below, the autumn leaves in the park were turning brilliant shades of gold and red, a subtle reminder that change, even when brought on by a collapse, can be a beautiful thing. The door opened and Frank stepped in. He didn't knock timidly like those anxious employees Ryan had hired. He knocked with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he belonged there. Frank looked 10 years younger. The dark circles beneath his eyes were gone, replaced by the unmistakable spark of a man doing what he loved. He had returned as the CEO of Coleman Construction, and in just 90 short days, he had managed to turn our losses around. "Harry," he said, placing a report onto my desk, "you're going to love this. We just secured the contract for the hospital's new wing, and the bank has fully restored our credit rating. The financial bleeding has completely stopped." I let out a genuine smile, one that reached all the way to my eyes. "Thank you, Frank. I knew you could do it. I should have never let you leave in the first place." "I didn't go too far, Harry," he chuckled softly. "Just far enough to appreciate coming back." He pointed to the cup in my hand. "Is that from the high-end espresso machine?" "No," I said, holding up the paper cup. "I walked down the street and bought it from the cart on the corner. $2, cash." Frank nodded, understanding the symbolism immediately. "Best cup of coffee in the world, isn't it?" "It tastes like freedom, Frank," I said. "It tastes like absolute control." Frank returned to his office, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I turned my chair toward the window, thinking about where my family was right now. Ryan and Megan were currently awaiting trial. Their attorneys were trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence Peterson assembled was airtight. They were facing anywhere from 5 to 10 years in prison. Their trip to Tuscany was going to have to wait, and the only Italian they'd be learning was the brand of pasta served in the cafeteria. Then there was Brenda, my wife, or rather my ex-wife, as of last week when the final divorce papers were processed. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope, a progress report sent by a private investigator I'd hired. I wanted to make sure she wasn't plotting anything, and I wanted to be certain she realized the well had completely run dry. Opening the folder, I found a photograph attached to the top report, showing a woman in a light blue uniform and apron wiping down tables at a roadside diner on the outskirts of town. She looked completely worn out. The hair she used to get styled every single week was pulled back into a messy bun, and her long manicured nails were cut short and bare. Brenda was working as a waitress. I read the report carefully. She was living in a tiny studio apartment above a garage, taking the public bus to work every morning, spending her days serving coffee and eggs to truck drivers and night shift workers. I stared at the photograph, feeling a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't pity. Pity implies that someone is a victim of circumstance, but Brenda was a victim of her own arrogance. She'd had everything. A husband who cared for her, a beautiful home, and absolute security. Yet she tossed it all away simply because she wanted to see me beg. She had told me I would have to beg her for breakfast money. She had told me that without money, a man was nothing but noise. I reached into my desk for my checkbook, my personal checkbook tied to an account only I had access to. I pulled out my fountain pen, the very same pen I used to sign the eviction notice. Removing the cap, I flattened out a blank check. Pay to the order of Brenda Coleman. I wrote down the date. And then in the box for the amount, I carefully wrote out the figures. $500. On the line below, I spelled it out in words. $500. It was the exact amount she had loaded onto that green prepaid debit card. The exact sum she claimed was plenty for me to live on for a week. I tore the check from the book with a sharp, crisp sound. Taking a sheet of my personal stationery, I wrote a brief note. I didn't write a long letter. I didn't ask how she was doing, and I certainly didn't say I missed her. I wrote, "Here is your weekly allowance. Breakfast is on me. Don't spend it all on wine." I folded the check inside the note, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it, pressing my thumb firmly along the flap, feeling a deep sense of finality. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Susan, could you step in for a moment?" My new assistant, a sharp young woman working her way through law school, walked in. "Yes, Mr. Coleman?" "Please mail this out," I said, handing her the envelope. "Send it certified mail. I want to make sure she receives it personally." "Will do," she said, taking the letter. "Is there anything else?" "No, Susan," I said. "That will be all." She left the room, and I leaned back in my chair. I pictured Brenda receiving the letter, seeing the return address, opening it with trembling hands, hoping for reconciliation or a return to her lavish life. And then I pictured her seeing that check for $500 alongside that short note. It was harsh. I knew it was harsh, but it was also entirely necessary. A final period at the end of a long, painful chapter. It was my way of letting her know that our roles had permanently reversed. I was no longer the beggar. I was the provider. And she was finally learning the true value of $1. I took another sip of my coffee. It had gone cold, but it didn't matter. I felt completely warm inside. I looked around my office. It was quiet. For a long time, I had feared that kind of quiet, assuming silence meant loneliness, believing that a crowded house full of venomous people was better than an empty one. I was wrong. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was full of clarity and peace. I picked up the phone and called Frank. "Frank?" I said. "Yes, Harry?" "Regarding the hospital wing project," I instructed. "Double our donation to the pediatric center." "Double it?" Frank asked. "Harry, that's a substantial sum." "I know," I said, looking at the spot on my desk where the framed family photo used to sit. "But I've learned something, Frank. Money is like water. If you hoard it, it stagnates and rots. But if you keep it moving, it brings life. I want my money to build things up, not tear people down." "Understood, Harry," Frank said softly. "I'll have the paperwork drawn up right away." I hung up, stood up, and walked over to the window one last time. The setting sun cast a warm golden light across the city of Chicago. I was 72 years old, single, with a son in prison and an ex-wife working at a diner. By societal standards, my personal life looked like a complete disaster. Yet as I watched the city lights flicker on one by one, I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of gratitude. I held on to my dignity, my mind, my company, and above all else, the truth. I wasn't a burden, and I wasn't senile. I was Harry Coleman, a builder, and my greatest project was just getting started, living the rest of my life on my own terms. The old lion wasn't sleeping, he was awake, and for the first time in years the jungle was completely still. From this story we learn a harsh yet necessary truth about the nature of relationships and resources. Blood may connect us biologically, but it guarantees neither loyalty, respect, nor love. True family is defined by how people treat you when you are vulnerable, not by how much value they can extract from you when you are strong. Harry's experience proves that financial independence is the ultimate form of self-defense. We must never hand over the keys to our lives, our dignity, or our hard-earned success to anyone without thoroughly testing their character first, even if they are our own children. Generosity without boundaries isn't love. It's simply fuel for entitlement. Sometimes the most meaningful action you can take is to sever the connection and let people face the full consequences of their choices.